A man is executed by the state, nailed to wood, left to suffocate, confirmed dead by Roman soldiers who did this for a living. 3 days later, his tomb is empty, his followers claim he's alive, and 2,000 years later the case is still open. This is not a sermon, it's an investigation. The resurrection of Jesus is the most consequential historical claim ever made. If it happened, it changes everything about reality. If it didn't, Christianity collapses. Either way, the claim deserves the same rigorous examination we'd give any extraordinary event. So here's the question: what do historians, atheists, agnostics, and believers actually agree on? In 1975, a philosopher named Gary Habermas started doing something unusual. He began surveying every scholarly publication on the resurrection, over 1,400 books and articles spanning 3 decades, not just Christian scholars, everyone, atheists, agnostics, Jewish historians, secular academics. He wanted to find out, are there any facts about the resurrection that virtually all of them accept, not theological claims, not faith statements, historical facts. The kind of facts that survive peer review regardless of what you believe about God. He found them, a core set of facts accepted by 75 to 95% of critical scholars who have published on the subject. He called it the minimal facts approach. The idea is simple: start with what everyone agrees on. Don't assume the Bible is inspired. Don't assume miracles are possible. Just look at the data that survives the most hostile scrutiny. And then ask, what explains it? Think about what's at stake. If the resurrection happened, then a man who claimed to be God actually defeated death. That's not a minor religious claim, it's the most radical assertion in human history. If it didn't happen, then 2 billion people have built their lives on a delusion, and the most influential movement in human civilization was founded on a lie or a mistake. There is no middle ground, and the only way to approach a claim this consequential is with evidence, not with faith. Not with skepticism, with evidence. Fact 1. Jesus died by crucifixion. This is not controversial. It's accepted by virtually every scholar who has studied the question. Bart Ehrman, one of the world's most prominent agnostic New Testament scholars, puts it bluntly: one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. John Dominic Crossan, co-founder of the Skeptical Jesus Seminar, agrees that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Roman crucifixion was not survivable. A 1986 study in the Journal of the American Medical Association detailed the medical process: scourging that often exposed internal organs, followed by hours of asphyxiation on the cross. The survival rate was 0. No documented case exists of anyone surviving a full Roman crucifixion. Fact 2. The resurrection was proclaimed almost immediately. In his first letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul records a creed, a formal statement of belief that he says he received from others. Scholars have analyzed this creed exhaustively. Its structure is formulaic. Its vocabulary is non-Pauline. It contains Semitic features that point to an Aramaic-speaking origin. The consensus, and this is accepted by atheist scholars, is that this creed was formulated within 1 to 5 years of the crucifixion. Gerd Ludemann, an atheist New Testament professor at Göttingen, dates it to within 2 to 3 years. James Dunn, one of the most respected New Testament scholars of the 20th century, says it was formulated within months. To put that in perspective, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written over 300 years after his death. The earliest testimony to the resurrection, less than 5 years. And what does this creed say? That Christ died, was buried, was raised on the 3rd day, and appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 people at once, then to James, then to all the apostles, and finally to Paul himself. That's not a vague spiritual claim. It's a list of named witnesses. And Paul adds a remarkable detail: most of the 500 are still alive. He's inviting his readers to check. Fact 3. The tomb was empty. This one is more contested. Roughly 75% of scholars accept it, which makes it the weakest of the minimal facts. But the evidence is striking. First, the Jewish authorities never denied the tomb was empty. Their counter-argument recorded in Matthew was that the disciples stole the body. That's enemy attestation. They're conceding the tomb was empty and trying to explain it away. Second, the first witnesses to the empty tomb in all four Gospels are women. In first-century Jewish culture, women's testimony was considered unreliable. If you were inventing a story, you would never make women your primary witnesses. Third, the resurrection was proclaimed in Jerusalem, the one city where the tomb could be checked. If the body was still there, the movement would have been dead on arrival. Now, some scholars push back on this. Bart Ehrman argues that crucified criminals were typically left unburied, thrown into mass grave or left for scavengers. John Dominic Crossan goes further, suggesting Jesus' body may have been eaten by dogs. These are serious objections from serious scholars, but there's counter-evidence. The Jewish historian Josephus records that Jews were permitted to bury their dead before sunset, even crucifixion victims. And in 1968, archaeologists discovered the remains of a crucified man named Yehohanan in a Jerusalem tomb, with the nail still embedded in his heel bone. A crucified man properly buried. It happened. The question is whether it happened to Jesus. And roughly 3 out of 4 scholars who have studied the question say, yes, it did. Fact 4. Multiple people, on multiple occasions in multiple settings, claimed to see Jesus alive after his death. This is not a claim that the resurrection happened. It's a claim that the disciples had experiences they genuinely believed were encounters with the risen Jesus. And this is accepted by virtually all scholars. Even Gerd Ludemann, who spent his career arguing against the resurrection, wrote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Historically certain, from an atheist, the debate isn't about whether they had experiences, it's about what those experiences were. Consider the range of these appearances. They weren't confined to one person in one moment of grief. The Creed lists appearances to individuals, Peter, James, Paul, and to groups, the 12, the 500, all the apostles. They occurred over a period of weeks in different locations to people in different psychological states. Peter was grieving, Paul was hostile, James was skeptical. The 500 were, 500 people at once. Whatever explanation you propose for these experiences, it has to account for all of them. A theory that explains Peter's experience but not Paul's is incomplete. A theory that explains individual visions but not group experiences has a problem. The data is stubborn. Now consider the people who shouldn't have believed. Paul of Tarsus was a Pharisee, a devout Jew who considered the early Christians blasphemers. He didn't just disagree with them, he actively persecuted them. He was present at the stoning of Stephen. He went house to house, dragging Christians to prison. This is not a man predisposed to believe in a risen Jesus, and yet something happened to him. He claimed to have encountered the risen Christ. And he spent the rest of his life being beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and eventually executed for that claim. His letters, the earliest Christian documents we possess, are written by a man who clearly believes he saw something. Whatever it was, it turned a persecutor into an apostle. Then there's James, Jesus' own brother. During Jesus' ministry, James was a skeptic. The Gospels record that Jesus' family thought he was out of his mind. James was not a follower, but something changed. After the crucifixion, James appears in the historical record as the leader of the Jerusalem church, the most important position in early Christianity. Paul lists him as a recipient of a post-mortem appearance. And in AD 62, the Jewish historian Josephus records that James was executed for his faith. A skeptical brother who became a martyr. What changed his mind? And then there are the disciples themselves. After the crucifixion, they were hiding. Their leader had been publicly executed as a criminal. In first-century Judaism, a crucified Messiah was a failed Messiah. There was no theological framework for a dying and rising Messiah. The disciples had every reason to go home, mourn, and move on. Instead, within weeks, they were standing in the streets of Jerusalem, the city where Jesus was killed, proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. They were beaten for it, imprisoned for it. According to early tradition, most of them died for it. People die for beliefs they hold to be true. But these men weren't dying for a belief. They were dying for a claimed eyewitness experience. They didn't say, "We believe Jesus rose." They said, "We saw him." And here's what makes this even more puzzling. Within 20 years of the crucifixion, and possibly within months, these Jewish monotheists were worshipping Jesus as divine, praying to him, singing hymns to him, placing him alongside God in their liturgy. The scholar Martin Hengel calculated that more happened in Christological development in the first 20 years of Christianity than in the next 700. Larry Hurtado, one of the world's leading scholars of early Christian devotion, called it a mutation in Jewish monotheism that has no analogy in the Jewish tradition. Something extraordinary must have happened, he wrote, something powerful enough to make strict monotheists worship a crucified criminal as God, within a generation. So what do these facts prove? Let's be precise. They prove that Jesus was crucified and died. They prove that within 1 to 5 years, a formal creed was circulating that listed named witnesses to post-mortem appearances. They prove that the disciples had experiences they genuinely believed were encounters with the risen Jesus. They prove that hostile witnesses, a persecutor and a skeptical brother, converted based on claimed appearances. And they make a strong case that the tomb was empty. What they don't prove, and this is important, is that the resurrection happened. These are historical facts. The resurrection is an interpretation of those facts, and there are other interpretations. The hallucination hypothesis, the disciples experienced grief-induced visions. The legend theory, the stories grew over time. The cognitive dissonance theory, the disciples psychologically reinterpreted their shattered expectations. Each of these has been proposed by serious scholars. Each of them has serious problems, but they exist and they deserve examination. Here's what's remarkable. The debate among historians is not about whether something extraordinary happened, it's about what that something was. The atheist grants the experiences, the agnostic grants the early date, the Jewish scholar grants the empty tomb, the skeptic grants the conversions. They disagree about the explanation, but they agree on the data. And that data presents a historical puzzle that, after 2,000 years of scrutiny, remains unsolved. The Jewish scholar Jezza Vermes, who had no theological stake in the outcome, examined all the evidence and concluded, when every argument has been considered and weighed, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be that the opinions of the orthodox, the liberal, and the ultra-liberal alike are inadequate to account for the evidence. That's not a Christian speaking. That's an Oxford historian saying, none of the explanations work. Dale Allison, a Princeton seminary professor who has spent decades studying the resurrection, captures the tension perfectly. He accepts the empty tomb as probable. He takes the appearance traditions seriously. But he admits that historical method alone cannot tell us whether what happened was a miracle or something else entirely. His conclusion, I'm not sure that the historian can say much more than that something extraordinary happened to a handful of Jews in Roman Palestine. That's not evasion. That's intellectual honesty, and it's exactly where the evidence leaves us, staring at a set of facts that no one has fully explained. These are the facts. They're not Christian facts. They're not atheist facts. They're historical facts, and they demand an explanation. A man was executed. His tomb was found empty. His followers, his persecutor, and his skeptical brother all claimed to see him alive. The proclamation began within years, not centuries, of the events, and 2,000 years of scholarship has not produced a consensus explanation. In the next episode, we'll examine every theory that's been proposed to explain them, from hallucinations to stolen bodies to mass hysteria. We'll see which ones survive scrutiny, and which ones don't. The resurrection of Jesus is either the greatest event in human history or the greatest delusion, but it is not a question you can ignore. Because if a man really did walk out of a Roman tomb, then everything changes. And if he didn't, that changes things too. The investigation continues.